This video is sponsored by Squarespace. This is a very small fantasy house that I made, the smallest building I've ever crafted from scratch, and I made it out of paper from the recycling bin. I made it just to see if I could work much smaller than I usually do, despite my hand tremors, and I wanted to do it totally from scratch. I started with a piece of very thin cardboard, or I guess you could say very thick paper. It was a piece of a small box some paintbrushes came in, thin enough to fold, thick enough to have some strength. It was a good piece of paper. Since this build would be so small, I didn't want separate walls that needed to be glued together. I wanted to make the perimeter out of one piece of paper so that I could just fold it and only have to glue one joint of this very thin material. I based the layout on 1 centimeter high walls, with a building footprint of 1 centimeter by 2 centimeters. I very slightly scored the fold lines to keep them straight. To glue the paper quickly, I used super glue. And I sealed each edge with the glue first, because it tends to soak up super glue instantly and dry before you get things connected if you don't do this. This was pretty difficult for me with my shaky hands, and also tricky not to glue my fingers to the paper. But I managed and used more glue to reinforce the other corners and edges. Then I filled in the gaps on the overhang area with some more small strips of paper. This was also pretty difficult for me to manage, but I made it a little easier on myself by running some edges long to make them easier to glue. Then I could just cut the excess flush afterwards. My design had that typical medieval overhanging second floor, but because it was so small, it was kind of top heavy and needed to be built out in the back to give some more stability and to make it look a little less simple. I cut another piece for the back and glued it in place. I must have messed up somehow, making one side longer than the other because my back was way out of square. I sliced that corner, moved the wall in, glued it, and cut off the excess to correct that mistake. Now that the walls were done, I could cap the roof. Again, to make this task more manageable for my large shaky hands, I ran the pieces long to make gluing easier. And at this point, it was time to move on to the even smaller pieces of paper to decorate the base structure. But before I do that, let's take a second to look at this video's sponsor, Squarespace. I recently switched both my website blackmagiccraft.ca and idolsoftorment.com over to Squarespace. The process of moving them over and building new sites from scratch was wicked easy using Squarespace's intuitive templates and drag and drop layout editing. My websites are now both much nicer than before and have allowed me to integrate things like a web store and video. I love that Squarespace automatically makes a mobile version of your site as you design the desktop version. But what was a huge improvement for me over my last provider is that you can independently edit the mobile version without affecting the desktop one. I've used several well-known website building and hosting platforms as a content creator over the years, and I can say with full honesty and confidence that Squarespace is the absolute best I've used, and it's not even close. So if you need a website, go to Squarespace using the link in my description and start your free trial. When you're ready to launch, use the URL squarespace.com/blackmagiccraft to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code blackmagiccraft. The first step in adorning the faces of the building was establishing which side was the front and adding a teeny tiny door, which was just a simple small rectangle of paper. I then needed all the strips of wood for the Tudor-style exterior. I grabbed a piece of even thinner cardboard from some sort of packaging, and I cut very thin strips. Despite being as narrow as I thought I could get away with, they still looked too wide for the building, and I had to cut even narrower ones. Gluing these all in place was no easy task, and took some trial and error. Trying to get them stuck down in the right spot and not just ending up with them glued to my thumbs was hard. I very easily could have gotten frustrated at this step and just walked away, trashing the whole project. But I was taking this on as a personal challenge, a little obstacle to overcome. I wanted to remind myself and my viewers that yeah, sometimes doing hobby stuff can be frustrating and challenging, but if you just relax, take your time, and don't get too worked up about it, you can make your way through any challenge and you'll come out on the other side of it more confident than before, and with a completed project that can serve as a reminder not to give up easily when things get difficult. Oh, and I added a little overhang roof above the door. I don't want my teeny tiny people getting soaked in the rain when they're waiting at the door. Since the last step wasn't challenging enough, I moved on to even thinner paper to glue in place to finish off that Tudor decorative timber style. This ended up being easier than the first strips that I had put down. Maybe it was because they were all in open flat areas rather than edges. Maybe the paper was just easier to work with. Or maybe I was just more confident and relaxed having gotten through the first step. I don't know for sure, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is that I was able to get these little strips applied and had myself what was starting to look like a super duper cute little home. And then there were the shingles. I couldn't think of a better way to do this than just cutting and overlapping strips of paper. I think individual shingles would have been a fool's errand. I could maybe have cut notches into the strips before applying them to separate the shingles, but I had a feeling that would result in a mess, so I just went with my gut and did plain strips with the faith that it would just work out fine in the end. Once both sides were covered, I folded one final strip to cap off the top. And this looked pretty decent, but I did still want to have that look of individual shingles, so I tried something, and it worked. I was able to take my X-Acto knife and lightly score the shingle seams. After realizing I could do this, I also scored in some lines into each of the timber strips to try to give them a bit of wood grain texture. Despite being so small and being made with my big shaky meat paws out of garbage, I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of detail I was able to put into this. Up close it's rough looking, but in real life from an arm's distance, it looked great. I didn't bother priming this and instead just gave it a base coat in a medium walnut brown. With it all based out brown, I could then get to work carving out the plaster details. Thankfully, painting small things is a lot easier than building small things, so at this point I could just relax and enjoy the process. I did a coat of all the plaster areas with a light beige, and then moved into an off-white. This time not going right up to the edges. I wanted to give some shadow, some weathering at this step so that I didn't have to put on washes later. I managed to keep this fairly clean, but I did need to touch up some of the wood with some brown paint. The window I kept simple and just painted it black. I didn't think messing around with lighting effects or gloss clear coats to simulate glass would make sense at this small scale. For the roof tiles, I went with a kind of burnt orange color. When doing Tudor fantasy houses, red and orange roofs seem to be my favorite. I like the way they complement the warm look of the building, but still stand out quite a bit, making the whole thing look a lot more fun. I realized at this point that I didn't want to give any pedantic YouTube commenters a chance to make snarky comments about the lack of chimney, even though a house like this wouldn't necessarily have a chimney, and I decided to add one. I could have used a toothpick or something, but I had made it this far building only with paper, so I made a paper chimney by saturating a strip of construction paper in water and glue and rolling it into a tube. I drilled a hole in the roof and glued it in place. It just needed a bit of wrought iron metallic and I could call it finished. Like I said at the pre-paint phase, this little home looks kind of rough up close, especially on camera, but in real life, at a normal viewing distance, it actually looks great. It looks like a believable fantasy building from a bird's eye view. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this, but it's got me pretty tempted to build it into some sort of base or diorama. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like it, share it, and drop me a comment below. And while you're there, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you want to support the channel and the work that I do, you can do your hobby shopping through my affiliate links on blackmagiccraft.ca or join the channel's Patreon. Either way, I wish you happy crafting and look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.